So, lately I've been really into this kind of practice of finding hidden gems in films that were dismissed as bad by critics upon their initial release. Now, of course, no film is without its faults, and sometimes a movie really is just objectively bad, but surprisingly often I'll feel that a film was judged unfairly because of a fundamental error in understanding the film in question. And very, very often, the kinds of films that end up being at the receiving end of this kind of harsh and unwarranted judgment are films about, for, and or made by women. Now, RottenTomatoes.com is a great place to start. Because of the nature of the site, a score for any film is an aggregation of all of the reviews selected to represent it. Now, obviously, this system has kind of the inherent problem of, well, what if the demographics of critics skews heavily towards one particular kind of people? The fact is, it's simply easier to find meaning and identify with narratives and characters that are closest to yourself. So, if a film features, say, a young biracial girl or a queer character, a straight white male critic is going to be a lot less likely to find something in it that resonates with him, which makes him either less likely to speak positively about that film or just not care much to take the time to see, write about, and give exposure to that film in the first place. And because the majority of critics are white men, this is seen constantly. This year, Martha M. Lausen published the results of an ongoing study sponsored by the Center for the Study of Women in Television and Film, which found that men comprise of about 68% of film reviewers to women's 32%, and even more disparate white reviewers at around 82% to 18% non-white or just unknown. It's the same principle, and actually pretty close to the same ratio, that dictates the Academy of Motion Picture Science's consistent overrepresentation of white male narratives at the Oscars. So, in the case of films that are targeted towards a female demographic, it comes as really no surprise that many end up being dismissed by critics, subsequently affecting their general audience perceptions and then sometimes box office numbers, which in combination determines whether a film is seen as a success or as a failure. Now, once you start looking for them, these failure films pop up everywhere. From 1998's Practical Magic, a kind of twisted but ultimately fun story about two witch sisters and their romantic misfortunes, currently holding a 20% on Rotten Tomatoes. Critics didn't really know what to make of it, and they weren't really able to assign it any specific genre, and that confusion is a really common theme in how these films are talked about. And I think this stems from that fundamental misunderstanding of what the narratives are really trying to communicate and who they're trying to reach. And sometimes it's almost as if these critics don't even try to understand what's really going on and just dismiss them outright, using descriptors like unoriginal or cliche or having a bad script. We also see it with films like 2000's Bring It On, which actually really sensitively examines issues surrounding economic and racial inequality, how they're inextricably linked, as well as condemning cultural appropriation. And this is all told from the framework of just a fun, lighthearted narrative about two rival cheerleading teams. Okay, listen, this movie is great. Fight me. Or you've got the offbeat but brilliant satire, The Cheerleader, getting sent to conversion therapy in 1998's But I'm a Cheerleader, which has about 38% on Rotten Tomatoes for being surprisingly unoriginal and could have been better. God, are you serious? When has anyone ever made a movie like this? Or, you know, whatever. Okay. Or you've got the queer, kitschy subversiveness of 2013's comedy horror All Cheerleaders Die, which actually shares a lot of similarities with the focus subject of this video essay, 2009's Jennifer's Body, which is about a hot, popular cheerleader's horrific transfer... Wait, I think I'm sensing a pattern here. Anyway, I'll come back to Jennifer's Body in a second, because this pattern extends beyond great films that were misunderstood, but also to films that were misunderstood as trying to be, well, great. Like, listen, Twilight is bad, but it was also never trying to be something profoundly good. Those films were never anything more than representations of the most self-indulgent, concentrated turd of straight white girl romance fantasy imaginable. In a pretty similar vein, you've got a movie like 2013's Jupiter Ascending, which was hated by critics. The movie itself, it's about It's about a down-on-her-luck protagonist that dreams of something bigger and finds herself thrust into the middle of this huge intergalactic conflict without realizing they have secret ties to royalty and featuring fantastical sci-fi elements and... this is the wrong movie. I'm sorry. Okay. Anyway, this ordinary character is dragged into this crazy world by a hyper-competent, idealized romantic interest that saves them from a bunch of evil characters that are trying to kill our protagonist because they're super important and very special and shit. I'm sorry. Damn it. Anyway, our protagonist is told they're somehow destined for greatness, and it's also sort of a love story, and it can be a little hammy and campy at times, but it's exciting and visually spectacular, and in the end, the protagonist is the only one that can save the Earth, and they finally get together with a romantic interest, and... God damn it. Okay, but in all seriousness, what's crazy is that these two movies were both made by the Wachowski sisters, notably both trans women, which kind of helps explain the feminist themes that are often so present in their narratives. But, okay, seriously, The Matrix is awesome. I'm not disputing the fact that The Matrix is a great movie, but it's also still really campy and silly, and it completely embraces that idea of a wish fulfillment narrative, which is essentially exactly what Jupiter Ascending is, but for women. Why are these pieces of media not held to the same standard? I don't know. Why is that? Maybe I should have made this about Jupiter Ascending. Anyway, refocusing, the point being, these films about women, and especially the ones made by women, are held to a completely different standard than their equivalent male counterparts. Really quick, I apologize in advance for incorrect pronunciation, but female filmmaker Trinh Minh-ha talks about how these standards and interpretations differ between female-produced and male-produced media in her text, Questions of Images in Politics. She goes over that same confusion that I mentioned earlier and how men interpret films made from a female perspective. On page 148, she talks about how a film is a site that sets into play three subjective perspectives: that of the subjects occupying the narrative, that of the viewers, which includes those who have the means or are in a position to circulate, expose, and disseminate the films, including film critics, and that of the filmmaker. So, again, we've got A, who the film is about, B, who the film is for, and C, who made the film. With that in mind, let's talk about 2009's horror comedy Jennifer's Body, directed by Karen Kusama, written by Diablo Cody, and starring Megan Fox and Amanda Seyfried. All women. I'm going to start by talking about what this film is actually about and why it not only works, but works really well as a feminist narrative and a complete subversion of sexist cliches, not only in typical horror fare, but in female representation in film in general. Really quick, let's break the film down. Our protagonist is Needy, as in that's her name, Needy, and her best friend is the titular Jennifer. The film focuses on how their friendship changes after Jennifer is targeted to be a virgin sacrifice by an up-and-coming indie band in order to gain more success. Only she's not actually a virgin, and the botched sacrifice ends up giving her demonic powers and an insatiable need to consume human flesh, which keeps her looking fresh-faced and beautiful. She targets teenage boys in her school specifically, and as her behavior spirals out of control and more boys die, Needy starts to see what's going on, begins to see the monster that is her best friend, and ultimately the film ends with a chest-stabbing climax, and Needy is sent to a mental institution. The basic structure of this premise isn't necessarily new. Probably the two closest examples would be 1976's Carrie or 2000's Ginger Snaps, which both focus on female characters undergoing monstrous transformations and incurring their wrath on their peers. In all three of these films, these transformations are thematically linked to the character's sexuality in some way. Carrie and Ginger's respective horrors and transformations occur in tandem with their transitions into puberty, or from childhood innocence into womanly adulthood, with the latter even going so far as to parallel menstrual cycles with the lunar cycle that affects werewolves. Shelley Lindsey writes in one of her texts about Carrie specifically that, quote, by mapping the supernatural onto female adolescence and engaging the language of the fantastic, Carrie presents a masculine fantasy in which the feminine is constituted as horrific. In charting Carrie's path to mature womanhood, the film presents female sexuality as monstrous and constructs femininity as a subject position impossible to occupy, unquote. This construct also easily applies to Ginger Snaps, where, by contrast, Jennifer's Body completely opposes it. Instead, the horror of Jennifer's transformation is a direct result of her not being a virgin. And in fact, the transformation itself comes in tandem with a violent experience of being assaulted by a male character, which she had initially found attractive. Several visual cues signify this experience as representative of sexual assault, and the fact that her character transforms into a man-eating demon because of her trauma in many ways plays into a revenge fantasy narrative, despite the fact that technically Jennifer is the antagonist. This kind of nuance brings me to my next point. It would have been really easy to put Needy and Jennifer into kind of an archetypal narrative of the nerdy, innocent, victimized best friend that ultimately stands up to and defeats hot, evil demon cheerleader, but the film avoids this. Needy isn't some pure, innocent virgin. She has a healthy and active sexual relationship with her boyfriend. Jennifer, in turn, is presented as three-dimensional and almost tragic in her monstrosity being a direct result of the extreme trauma that she experienced, and which ultimately has desensitized her to the trauma that she inflicts on others. Eve Tuck and C. Ree's text, A Glossary of Haunting, highlights differences between Western and Eastern horror narratives in stating that Western narratives are clear-cut in their depictions of innocent victim and evil perpetrator and the justice in the defeat of this perpetrator, where Eastern narratives are a little more complex. When Needy ultimately kills Jennifer, not only is it, well, kind of sad, but some of those demonic powers are transferred to her, and she herself becomes the monster, and in the end, inflicts her revenge on the men that started the whole mess in the first place. As they describe on page 641, quote, rather than a heroic slaying, there is an anti-heroic relinquishing. Rather than resolution, deferment, unquote. Honestly, there's a lot that I could talk about in terms of why Jennifer's Body presents a subversive narrative with a uniquely female voice, from the nuance of queer attraction between Jennifer and Needy that feels very true to that teenage time of questioning, to how unapologetic Jennifer is in her objectification of male characters, to the codependency and toxicity of Needy and Jennifer's relationship, and how that manifests in ways that can be both very sad and very funny.
You're a jerk. Wow, nice insult, Hannah Montana. You got any more harsh digs?
Listen, this movie is great. Hopefully I've established that in some capacity, and if not, there are a surprising number of online publications from Vox to Vice that have gone way in depth about why this movie is good, even just in the last month. So let's move on to my next point. So now we've got our A, who the film is about. Let's move on and talk about B, who the film is for. I'm going to circle back around to Twilight for a second, because in order to understand why this movie was received so poorly, we have to talk about the audience, or rather, the targeted audience. This film was marketed as what the late film critic Roger Ebert described in its review of Jennifer's Body as Twilight for boys. Without actually knowing anything about the film, this is what audiences were told to expect. In Laura Mulvey's well-known text, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, she talks about the concept of the male gaze and how the female character's body and image is made the passive subject to an active male perspective, and so possesses very little agency of her own. The marketing for Jennifer's Body capitalized on this idea, selling the film as, hey, remember that really hot girl from Transformers that you ogled 2 years ago? Well, she is back, and now she's a sexy demon vampire thing. Come ogle her again in our movie, in which she is, again, very sexy and might even make out with another girl. What? This complete misdirection of communicating to audiences what they were in for is probably the biggest source of the disconnect that I really believe caused this movie to be a critical and commercial failure. Which segues us pretty nicely into C, who made the film. In a recent interview with Vox, the film screenwriter Diablo Cody expressed frustration with this marketing approach, that her thought response had been,
girls are good. No, this movie is for girls. And like, none of that was, that audience, they did not attempt to reach. So,
really quickly, I think it's very interesting to note that the male interviewer that took that audio transcribed it for the article to look like this. Anyway, Cody clearly saw the disconnect between how the film was being marketed and what it actually was, and even said in another interview in 2013 with Film School Rejects, brilliantly titled, Diablo Cody Threatens People with Unlikable Women, quote, I feel like it was marketing this sexy commercial horror movie for guys where Megan Fox is just eye candy, and the movie isn't that. It's this offbeat feminist horror comedy. I mean, who is the audience for that? Not a very big one. I don't think it's surprising that that movie wasn't a blockbuster. I certainly didn't expect that." Unquote. I would argue that she and Karen Kusama, the film's director, were fully aware of the concept of the male gaze and that in large part their goal was to subvert it. On page 60, Julie Casali writes in her text about Jennifer's Body, quote, "Cody and Kusama disengage the male viewers by attempting to subvert their gaze, forcing them to watch themselves be violated and vulnerable in a horror movie for a change," unquote. The fact that it's Megan Fox specifically, who is kind of the embodiment of the male gaze itself in a lot of ways, the fact that she's the one enacting these very violent subversions, it adds what was likely a very intentional meta element to the storytelling. It should be stated too, and this was mentioned in the same interview with Diablo Cody I referenced a second ago, that at the time Megan Fox had been experiencing some turbulent criticism in the media for some comments she made comparing Michael Bay to Hitler or something. I don't know. Michael Bay is basically a crazy person, so it was probably warranted. And also Diablo Cody had just come off an Oscar win for Best Original Screenplay for Juno, and so had started to receive some backlash because her success was bad. I don't know. Anyway, all that to say, there was some negative media perceptions surrounding some of the people involved in the making of the film, which largely just happened to be women. I do think all of these factors played into why the film was received and performed so poorly, but more than anything, I think that the root cause for the failure of Jennifer's Body and the similar failure of so many other female-driven pieces of media is a disparity between expectation and reality, and the misconception that unmet expectations are equivalent to a communication failure. There's a difference between a poorly executed narrative and a narrative that takes maybe a little bit more effort to understand simply because the subject is different from yourself. That issue at its core, yes, is largely due to the fact that the critical media is predominantly white and male. But so too is it an issue of a necessary exercise in empathy that these critics often just refuse to perform because they expect to be given something universal, something that caters to the standard of a white male narrative. On page 149 of her text, Minh-ha condemns the idea of a universally accessible narrative, that it, quote, "often encourages a leveling of differences, a minimum of elements that might offend the imaginary average viewer, and a standardization of content and expectations," unquote. The truth is, there's no such thing as an average viewer. There are movies made for certain people and not necessarily for others. And there are viewers that are willing to embrace that and empathize with difference. And there are the ones that refuse to see beyond their own perspectives and will only engage with a narrative that reinforces their own experiences. You didn't give Jennifer's Body a 44% on Rotten Tomatoes because it was a bad movie. You gave it a 44% because it wasn't made for you. It was made for me.